The morning sun cast long shadows across the landing platform as Professor Zixtal watched the transport ships arrive at Verdania Station. The old Catharian instructor had been running the Galactic Academy's survival course for 37 years, and he had seen every kind of student imaginable. His gray scales caught the light as he moved his forearms in practiced gestures, checking his datapad for the list of this semester's participants. Verdania was perfect for survival training. The planet's forests stretched for thousands of miles. Without any cities or technology, the trees grew thick and tall, creating a green canopy that filtered sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. Streams ran clear and cold through valleys filled with edible plants and harmless wildlife. It was challenging enough to test young minds, but safe enough that Professor Zixtal rarely lost students. The first transport door opened with a hiss of escaping air. Out stepped the Gorvak twins, Thrum and Kess, their massive, rock-like bodies making the platform shake with each step. Gorvaks came from a desert world where survival meant finding water and staying cool during blazing hot days. These two brothers stood 8 feet tall and their skin looked like granite. But Professor Zixtal knew they would struggle with Verdania's humidity and thick vegetation. The second transport brought Silwan, a Nilari whose pale blue skin seemed to glow in the morning light. Her people evolved in the oceans of their homeworld, developing gills behind their ears and webbed fingers that helped them swim. Silwan moved with the fluid grace of someone who spent most of her life underwater, but Professor Zixtal wondered how she would handle 3 days away from large bodies of water. Click single quotes. Tar emerged from the third transport, his compound eyes scanning the platform in quick, jerky movements. The Zephyrian's insect-like appearance often made other species uncomfortable, but Professor Zixtal knew their kind were peaceful plant-eaters with excellent eyesight for spotting food sources. Clicktar's thin exoskeleton would provide little protection against Verdania's cool nights and occasional rain showers. The fourth transport carried several other students from various worlds, each bringing their own advantages and weaknesses to the survival challenge. Professor Zixtal had taught representatives from dozens of species over the years, and he understood how each would likely approach the test ahead. Then the final transport arrived, and Professor Zixtal felt his stomach tighten with familiar worry. The door opened to reveal 2 humans, and the professor immediately recognized the casual confidence that marked their species. Jake Martinez stepped out first, a young man with brown hair and dark eyes who carried his pack like it weighed nothing. Amy Collins followed, her blonde hair tied back in a simple ponytail, and her green eyes already studying the forest in the distance. Humans had only joined the Galactic Academy 15 years ago, but they had already earned a reputation that made other species nervous. They solved problems in ways that seemed impossible, survived situations that should have killed them, and approached dangerous challenges with an attitude that other species found either inspiring or terrifying. Professor Zixtal had taught humans before, and the experience always left him questioning everything he thought he knew about survival training. The professor gathered all the students around him on the platform and began his traditional speech. He explained that they would spend the next 3 days in Verdania's forest with only basic tools. Each student received a simple knife, 50 feet of rope, and a fire starter. They could eat any plants or small animals they found, but they had to provide their own shelter, water, and protection from the elements. The forest can be dangerous if you make poor choices, Professor Zixtal said, his voice carrying across the platform. You will be monitored by drones, but we will only intervene if your life is in immediate danger. This test measures your ability to think clearly under pressure and use your natural abilities to survive in an unfamiliar environment. The alien students nodded seriously, already forming small groups based on their species' strengths. Thrum and Cass stood together, planning to use their rock-hard skin and physical strength to build a sturdy shelter. Silwan asked about water sources and seemed relieved to learn that several streams ran through the test area. Clicktar began asking detailed questions about which plants were safe to eat and which ones might be poisonous. Jake and Amy listened to the briefing with quiet attention, but they did not join any groups or ask many questions. They simply checked their gear, adjusted their packs, and waited for the signal to begin. Professor Zixtal noticed that other students kept glancing at the humans with expressions of worry and curiosity when the transport ships departed, leaving the students alone. On the edge of the vast forest, the real test began. The alien students spent several minutes discussing strategies and sharing knowledge about survival techniques their species had developed. They formed alliances and made plans for finding food, water, and materials for building shelters. Jake and Amy walked to the forest edge and studied the trees for a moment. They spoke quietly to each other, pointing at different areas and nodding in agreement. Then they simply shouldered their packs and walked into the forest without any dramatic speeches or complex planning sessions. The other students watched the humans disappear into the green shadows with a mixture of confusion and concern. Professor Zixtal activated the monitoring drones and settled in to watch what promised to be another interesting 3 days. He had learned never to underestimate any species, but humans always managed to surprise him in ways that challenged everything he thought he understood about survival, adaptation, and the art of simply refusing to give up when faced with impossible odds. 24 hours had passed since the students entered Verdania's forest, and Professor Zixtal was beginning to worry about several of his charges. The monitoring station's screens showed feeds from dozens of tiny drones following each student group through the thick vegetation. Most of the displays painted a concerning picture of struggle and frustration. Thrum sat beside a pile of broken rocks, holding his injured hand against his chest. The massive Gorvak had tried to break stones to build a shelter wall, but Verdania's rocks were different from those on his desert homeworld. Instead of splitting cleanly along natural fault lines, these stones had shattered unpredictably, sending sharp fragments flying. One piece had sliced deep into the palm of his hand, and dark blue blood still seeped between his thick fingers. His brother Kes paced nearby, his heavy footsteps crushing small plants and leaving deep impressions in the soft forest soil. The Gorvaks were built for open desert spaces where they could see for miles in every direction. Verdania's dense trees made Kes feel trapped and anxious. Every rustling leaf sounded like a potential threat, and the humid air made it difficult for him to regulate his body temperature properly. "We should have found a cave," Kes rumbled in his deep voice, his rocky skin glistening with moisture. "This forest is wrong for our kind. Too many shadows, too many hiding places for dangerous creatures." Thrum nodded painfully and tried to flex his injured hand. The bleeding had slowed, but he could not grip anything properly anymore. Building their planned stone shelter would be impossible with only one functional hand, and Kes was too agitated by the unfamiliar environment to work effectively. Several miles away, Silwan knelt beside a stream that should have been perfect for her aquatic nature. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, exactly the kind of environment where Nalari thrived. But something was wrong with this particular stream. Despite its clean appearance, the water tasted bitter and left an unpleasant burning sensation in her gills. The young Nalari had filled her water containers from the stream early that morning, not realizing that upstream runoff contained minerals that were harmless to most species but toxic to her people's sensitive respiratory system. Now she felt dizzy and nauseated, her pale blue skin developing an unhealthy gray tint as her body fought the contamination. Silwan tried to filter more water through the cloth from her pack, but the bitter taste remained. She knew she needed clean water soon or her condition would worsen rapidly. The irony of dying from thirst while sitting beside a flowing stream was not lost on her, but her species had evolved in carefully balanced ocean environments where water quality was never a concern. Kliktar had managed slightly better than his classmates, using his compound eyes to identify several edible plants and berries. The Zephyrian's ability to see in multiple spectrums allowed him to spot nutritious vegetation that other species would miss entirely. He had gathered enough food to last several days and found a fallen log that provided some shelter from wind, but Kliktar's thin exoskeleton was never designed for extended exposure to cool, damp conditions. His joints ached constantly, and his movements became slower and more labored as the hours passed. The shelter he had woven from branches and leaves kept out the worst of the wind, but moisture seeped through the gaps, leaving him perpetually cold and miserable. As night approached for the second time, Kliktar huddled deeper into his inadequate shelter and tried to conserve body heat. His compound eyes detected movement in the darkness around him, probably just small nocturnal animals, but his nervous system interpreted every shadow as a potential threat. Professor Zixtel watched these scenes unfold with growing concern. Emergency protocols existed for situations where students face serious injury or illness, but intervening too early would invalidate the entire test. The professor had to balance student safety against the educational value of overcoming real challenges. The monitoring station's attention shifted to feeds from the human students, and Professor Zixtal found himself staring at something completely unexpected. Jake and Amy had not only established a basic camp, but were engaged in what appeared to be a serious construction project. The two humans worked with focused efficiency, using their knives to cut straight branches from specific trees. Amy seemed to have an intuitive understanding of which wood would be strong enough for structural support and which pieces were better suited for lighter framework. Jake tested each joint and connection point, making small adjustments to ensure everything fit together properly. They had started by selecting a massive oak-like tree with thick, horizontal branches about 15 feet above the ground. Amy climbed up easily, moving through the branches like she had been doing it her entire life. She secured their rope around the strongest limbs while Jake passed up carefully cut lumber pieces. What emerged from their efforts looked like something that belonged in a construction manual rather than a survival situation. The humans were building an actual treehouse, complete with a raised platform, walls, and what appeared to be the framework for a slanted roof. Professor Zixtel ran the construction footage through the monitoring station's analysis systems. The computer calculated load-bearing capacities, stress distributions, and structural integrity ratings. According to the analysis, the human shelter was not only safe but would actually meet Academy building standards for permanent structures. The most remarkable aspect was not the sophistication of their construction, but the casual attitude the humans displayed while working. Drone footage captured them laughing and chatting as they fitted pieces together, as if building a complex elevated shelter was no more challenging than preparing a simple meal. Jake paused in his work to drink water from a container that Amy had apparently filled and purified using some technique the drones had not recorded. Amy took a break to eat what looked like a carefully prepared meal made from forest plants and small fish she had caught from a nearby stream. Professor Zixtal realized that while his other students were struggling with basic survival needs, the humans had moved far beyond mere endurance. They were not just surviving in the forest but actively improving their situation using skills that seemed to come naturally to their species. The professor began accessing Earth's cultural databases, trying to understand where these abilities came from. What he discovered made him even more concerned about the gap between human capabilities and those of his other students. Humans had been building elevated shelters for thousands of years, adapting to countless different environments across their homeworld. What looked like extraordinary engineering to other species was simply common knowledge passed down through human families and communities. The second day brought new challenges for the struggling alien students. Thrum's injured hand had swollen during the night, making it impossible for him to grip tools or help his brother with their shelter project. The Gorvak twins had managed to stack some rocks into a low wall, but gaps between the stones allowed wind and moisture to penetrate their inadequate refuge. Kess tried to fill the gaps with mud and leaves, but the forest soil was too sandy to hold together properly. His massive hands, perfectly designed for handling the dry clay of his desert homeworld, could not work effectively with Verdania's damp earth. Every time he thought he had sealed a gap, the next gust of wind would blow his makeshift mortar away. "Brother, this place fights us at every turn," Kess said, frustration evident in his rumbling voice. "Our ancestors would have found water and built proper shelter by now, but this green maze confuses everything I know about survival." Thrum nodded weakly and tried once again to move his swollen fingers. The injury was not life-threatening, but it had reduced his effectiveness by half. Without both hands working properly, he could not help with the heavy lifting and precise work that stone construction required. Silwan's condition had worsened overnight. The contaminated water had triggered a mild infection in her gill slits, causing them to swell and making it difficult for her to breathe properly. Her pale blue skin now showed patches of gray discoloration, and she moved with the slow, careful steps of someone fighting illness. She had tried to find alternative water sources, following game trails and searching for springs that might be cleaner than the contaminated stream. But Verdania's water systems were complex, with multiple tributaries carrying different mineral contents from various geological formations. Without sophisticated testing equipment, Silwan had no way to determine which sources were safe for her species. The young Nalari sat beside a clear pool, staring at her reflection in the still water. She knew that drinking from another unknown source might make her condition worse, but dehydration was becoming a more immediate threat than contamination. Her people's biology required large amounts of clean water to function properly, and she was already past the safe limit for fluid deprivation. Kliktar had spent most of the morning trying to reinforce his lean-to shelter, but his efforts only highlighted how poorly designed it was for Verdania's conditions. The Zephyrian's compound eyes allowed him to see structural problems clearly, but his delicate manipulator appendages were not strong enough to make significant improvements. Rain had started falling before dawn, turning Kliktar's inadequate shelter into a cold, wet trap. Water dripped through the gaps in his woven roof, pooling on the ground and soaking into his bedding. His exoskeleton, designed for the warm, dry climate of his homeworld, provided no insulation against the persistent dampness every joint in. Kliktar's body ached from the cold moisture, and his movements became increasingly stiff and painful. He tried to start a fire using his assigned fire starter, but everything in the forest was too wet to burn properly. The few sparks he managed to create fizzled out immediately in the damp conditions. Professor Zixtel watched these scenes with growing alarm. 3 different species were showing signs of serious distress, and the test was only halfway complete. Emergency extraction protocols would normally be activated when students faced multiple health risks, but something on the monitoring screens made him pause before reaching for the emergency. Communications. The drone feeds from the human students showed something that challenged everything Professor Zixtel thought he understood about survival situations. In the space of just 3 hours, Jake and Amy had completed what could only be described as an architectural marvel by any reasonable standard. Their treehouse stood 15 feet above the forest floor, built around the massive trunk of an ancient oak-like tree. The structure featured a solid platform measuring roughly 12 feet by 8 feet, with walls that rose 4 feet high on 3 sides. The 4th side remained partially open but included a clever door system made from woven branches. Amy had engineered a slanted roof using long, straight branches positioned at precisely the right angle to shed water away from the living space. The roof covering consisted of overlapping layers of large leaves and strips of bark, creating a waterproof barrier that would have impressed professional builders. Jake had carved drainage channels in the platform floor to direct any water that did penetrate toward designated runoff points. He had also created storage areas under protective overhangs and established a work surface where they could prepare food and maintain their equipment. The most remarkable feature was Amy's pulley system, constructed entirely from their assigned rope and carved wooden components. The system allowed them to haul supplies up to their elevated home without having to climb while carrying heavy loads. She had even included a counterweight mechanism that made lifting easier and safer. Professor Zixtel ran detailed structural analysis on the treehouse using the monitoring station's most sophisticated programs. The computer systems calculated stress loads, wind resistance, and foundation stability. According to every test, the human construction was not only sound, but would remain safe and comfortable through severe weather conditions. The analysis revealed engineering principles that matched techniques used in permanent academy structures. Load-bearing joints were properly reinforced, weight distribution followed optimal patterns, and the foundation attachment points would handle significant stress without failure. The humans had essentially built a small house that happened to be located in a tree. Even more impressive was the speed and efficiency with which they had completed the project. Drone footage showed Jake and Amy working together with seamless coordination, each anticipating what the other needed before being asked. They moved through the construction process with the confidence of experienced builders, testing connections, adjusting angles, and solving problems as they arose. What struck Professor Zixtal most was the casual attitude the humans maintained throughout their work. They talked and laughed while fitting pieces together, pausing occasionally to share food or discuss minor design adjustments. Building a complex shelter in an alien forest seemed to require no more mental effort than setting up a simple tent. The monitoring equipment captured audio of their conversations, revealing that Jake had learned basic construction techniques from his grandfather, while Amy's family regularly engaged in camping and outdoor activities. What appeared to be extraordinary engineering skills were actually common knowledge passed down through human families as part of their cultural heritage. As the second day progressed, the contrast between human success and alien struggle became increasingly dramatic. While Thrung nursed his injured hand and Kess fought with unsuitable building materials, Jake and Amy relaxed on their covered porch, safe and dry above the forest floor. While Silwan struggled with contaminated water and Kliktar shivered in his inadequate shelter, the humans enjoyed clean water and comfortable accommodations. Professor Zixtal began to understand that he was witnessing something more significant than just human adaptability. The treehouse represented thousands of years of accumulated survival knowledge, passed down through generations of humans who had learned to thrive in every environment their homeworld could offer. What looked like individual brilliance was actually the collective wisdom of an entire species that had never stopped learning how to build homes wherever they found themselves. The third day arrived with the worst weather Verdania had experienced in months. Dark clouds gathered before dawn, bringing winds that bent the forest trees and sent leaves flying in wild spirals. Professor Zixtal watched the storm approach on weather monitoring systems and felt his stomach clench with worry for his students. Rain began falling in heavy sheets that turned the forest floor into a maze of slippery mud and rushing water. Wind howled through the trees with enough force to snap smaller branches and send them crashing to the ground. What had been a challenging but manageable survival test was rapidly becoming a dangerous emergency situation. The monitoring drones struggled to maintain position in the fierce weather, but their feeds still showed the catastrophic failure of the alien students' shelters. Thrum and Kess huddled in their leaking stone shelter as water poured through the gaps they had never managed to seal properly. The sandy soil beneath their wall began to wash away, causing several rocks to shift and threaten the entire structure's stability. Thrum's injured hand throbbed with pain made worse by the cold dampness, while Kess tried desperately to hold their shelter together with his bare hands. The massive Gorvak's strength was useless against the persistent water that turned their refuge into a cold, miserable trap. Both brothers were showing early signs of hypothermia as their body temperatures dropped in the wet conditions. "We must signal for extraction," Thrum said through chattering teeth, his voice barely audible over the storm. "This shelter will not protect us much longer, and my hand needs medical attention." Kess nodded grimly and reached for his emergency beacon but hesitated before activating it. Calling for rescue would mean failing the survival test completely, ending their academy careers before they truly began. Yet staying in their collapsing shelter might mean risking serious injury or worse. Silwan's situation had become critical during the night. The infection in her gills had spread, making breathing extremely difficult and painful. Her skin had turned an alarming shade of gray, and she moved with the slow, weak motions of someone whose body was shutting down from contamination and dehydration. The storm's arrival made everything worse for the young Nalari, rain mixed with the contaminated stream water, creating rushing torrents that carried even more dissolved minerals from upstream geological formations. Any hope of finding clean water had disappeared with the weather, and Silwan knew she was running out of time. She curled up beneath a fallen log, trying to protect herself from the worst of the wind and rain. Her emergency beacon lay within reach, but using it would mean admitting defeat in front of her academy classmates. Nalari culture valued persistence and endurance, but Silwan was beginning to understand that sometimes survival required accepting help rather than struggling alone. Clictar's lean-to had collapsed completely within the first hour of the storm. The Zephyrian's delicate construction techniques, perfectly suited for his homeworld's stable conditions, could not withstand Verdania's violent weather. Branches that had seemed secure in calm conditions were torn apart by wind gusts that hit. With the force of small explosions, the insectoid student now crouched beneath a rocky overhang that provided minimal protection from the elements. His exoskeleton, already weakened by 2 days of cold moisture, had developed several small cracks that leaked precious body heat. Clictar's compound eyes detected every flash of lightning and movement of debris, keeping him in a constant state of nervous exhaustion. His emergency beacon had fallen somewhere in the wreckage of his shelter, buried under fallen branches and scattered supplies. Even if Clictar could find it, his manipulator appendages were too stiff from cold to operate the device properly. He was trapped in a nightmare of wind and rain with no way to call for help. Professor Zixtal faced the most difficult decision of his teaching career. Emergency extraction teams stood ready to launch rescue operations, but deploying them in such severe weather would put even more lives at risk. The monitoring station's computers calculated probability matrices for various rescue scenarios, and none of them looked promising. The professor's finger hovered over the emergency protocol's activation switch. Calling off the test would mean admitting that the Academy's most prestigious survival course was too dangerous to continue. Students from dozens of worlds would lose confidence in the program, and funding for future training exercises would certainly be reduced or eliminated. Entirely. Yet watching his students suffer in conditions beyond their capabilities felt like a betrayal of everything the Academy stood for. Professor Zixtal had seen challenging weather before, but never combined with so many equipment failures and medical problems. The situation was spiraling toward disaster with frightening speed. Then the monitoring station's attention was drawn to feeds from the human students, and Professor Zixtal witnessed something that changed his understanding of survival completely. Jake and Amy sat warm and dry inside their elevated treehouse, watching the storm through windows that Amy had fitted with clever shutters. Their shelter remained perfectly stable despite wind gusts that were toppling trees elsewhere in the forest. But what happened next demonstrated something even more remarkable than human engineering skills. Jake spotted movement through one of their windows and pointed toward the area where Thrum and Kess were struggling with their collapsing shelter. Amy immediately moved to another window and began scanning the forest for other students in distress. Without any discussion or hesitation, the two humans began preparing for a rescue operation. Amy rigged their rope system with additional safety lines while Jake gathered supplies that might be needed for treating injuries or providing emergency shelter. They moved with the calm efficiency of people who had trained for emergency situations their entire lives. Professor Zixtal watched in amazement as Jake and Amy descended from their treehouse into the heart of the storm. They moved through the dangerous conditions with confident steps, using techniques that seemed to come naturally to them. Amy led the way toward the Gorvak twins' failing shelter while Jake followed with emergency supplies and medical equipment improvised from their survival kit. The humans reached Thrum and Kess just as their stone wall finally gave way completely. Jake immediately began examining Thrum's infected hand while Amy assessed the structural damage to their shelter. Within minutes, they had established that the Gorvaks needed immediate evacuation to safer conditions, using rope techniques that Professor Zixtal had never seen before. Amy rigged a secure harness system that would allow the massive Gorvaks to be safely transported through the forest. Jake improvised a splint for Thrum's hand using materials from his pack, demonstrating medical knowledge that went far beyond basic first aid training. The monitoring drones followed the rescue operation as Jake and Amy guided both Gorvak brothers through the storm toward their treehouse. The humans moved with absolute confidence despite conditions that had defeated every other student in the test. They seemed to instinctively understand how to travel safely through dangerous terrain while helping injured companions. Professor Zixtel realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in Academy history. Instead of competing against their classmates, the humans had recognized a crisis situation and immediately shifted into rescue mode. Their treehouse was about to become a refugee center for students whose own survival strategies had failed completely. The storm continued to rage as Jake and Amy completed their systematic rescue of every struggling student in the forest. After safely delivering Thrum and Kess to the treehouse, they immediately set out again to find Silwan and Clicktar. Professor Zixtel watched through the monitoring drones as the humans navigated the dangerous conditions with skills that seemed impossible for beings their age. Amy found Silwan first, curled beneath the fallen log with her skin turned an alarming shade of gray. The young Nalari was barely conscious, her gills swollen and infected from contaminated water. Amy immediately recognized the symptoms of mineral poisoning and began treating Silwan with techniques that appeared to come from extensive medical training. Jake arrived with Clicktar a few minutes later, having located the Zephyrian's emergency beacon buried under storm debris. The insectoid student was suffering from severe hypothermia, his exoskeleton cracked and leaking precious body heat. Jake had wrapped Clicktar in his own waterproof gear and was carrying him carefully to avoid further damage to his fragile body. Structure. The treehouse that had originally been designed for 2 occupants now sheltered all 5 students from the deadly storm. Amy had somehow expanded their living space, using emergency techniques that maximized available room while maintaining structural integrity. Jake distributed their food supplies equally among all the students and began treating the various injuries and medical conditions that threatened his classmates. Professor Zixtel watched in fascination as the humans transformed their personal shelter into a medical station and refugee center. Amy purified water using filtration methods that removed the minerals poisoning Silwan, while Jake improvised treatments for hypothermia that slowly brought Clicktar back to normal body temperature. Neither human seemed to consider these extraordinary skills unusual or worth mentioning. Thrum stared at his properly bandaged hand and flexed his fingers experimentally. The swelling had already begun to reduce under Jake's treatment, and the pain was manageable for the first time in 2 days. "How do you know so much about treating injuries?" the massive Gorvok asked in wonderment. Jake shrugged and continued. "Organizing medical supplies. My dad's a paramedic, so I grew up learning basic first aid. Amy's mom is a nurse, and her family goes camping a lot, so she knows outdoor medicine pretty well. This is just stuff our parents taught us when we were kids." Silwan sipped carefully from the container of purified water that Amy had prepared for her. The bitter taste was completely gone, and she could feel her gills beginning to clear as the contamination left her system. "Your people must have very advanced water treatment technology," she said weakly. Amy laughed and held up a simple cloth filter she had constructed using materials from her pack. "This is just basic camping stuff. Sand and charcoal filtration, plus boiling to kill bacteria. My family taught me this when I was 8 years old because clean water is the most important thing for survival anywhere." Clicktar huddled beneath Jake's waterproof poncho, feeling warmth return to his joints for the first time since the storm began. His compound eyes studied the human shelter with new appreciation for its sophisticated design. "You built this structure using only basic tools and rope. Such engineering requires years of specialized training." Jake tested one of the roof joints and made a minor adjustment to improve water drainage. "Not really. My grandfather was a carpenter, and he taught me how to work with wood when I was little. Amy learned construction stuff from her uncle, who builds houses. We just use the same techniques our families have been using forever." The alien students exchanged glances of amazement and growing understanding. What they had perceived as superhuman abilities were actually common knowledge, passed down through human families and communities. The skills that seemed impossible to achieve were simply part of normal human education, taught to children as basic life preparation. Professor Zixtel listened to these conversations through the monitoring equipment and felt his worldview shifting in fundamental ways. He had always assumed that survival skills were specialized knowledge requiring formal training and advanced technology. The humans were demonstrating that their species considered such abilities to be basic cultural heritage shared by ordinary families. As the storm gradually weakened and moved away from the forest, the rescued students began sharing their own culture's approaches to survival and adaptation. Thrum explained that Gorvuk society had become so specialized that individuals rarely learned skills outside their chosen professions. Silwen admitted that her people's aquatic nature made them dependent on carefully controlled environments with specific water conditions. Kliktar revealed that Zephyrian culture emphasized individual achievement and competition, discouraging the kind of cooperative problem-solving that came naturally to humans. Each alien species had developed advanced technologies and sophisticated social systems, but they had lost the fundamental survival skills that their ancestors once possessed. Your people never forgot how to take care of each other, Silwan observed, watching Jake check on everyone's condition for the third time. Even in a competition designed to test individual survival, you immediately began helping others when you saw they were in trouble. Amy secured the last of the storm shutters and tested the treehouse's stability once more. That's not really special. Humans have always survived by working together and sharing knowledge. When someone needs help, you help them. When someone knows something useful, they teach others. That's how we've made it this far as a species. The transport ships arrived as scheduled to collect the students, but Professor Zixtal had to revise his entire evaluation of the survival test. Every alien student had failed to complete the challenge successfully, requiring rescue by their human classmates. Yet the experience had taught them more about survival than any previous test in Academy history. Thrum and Kess helped dismantle the treehouse under Jake and Amy's direction, learning construction techniques that would serve them well in future survival situations. Silwan worked with Amy to understand water purification methods that could be adapted for her species-specific needs. Kliktar studied the humans' cooperative approach to problem-solving and began to question his culture's emphasis on individual competition. Professor Zixtal made extensive notes in his official report about the need for major curriculum revisions in the Academy's survival training program. The course had been designed to test individual endurance and basic resource management, but it had failed to address the cooperative skills and cultural knowledge that were essential for true survival in challenging conditions. As the students boarded the transport ships, they looked back at the empty clearing where the treehouse had stood. The structure was gone, but its impact would remain with them forever. They had learned that survival was not about enduring hardship alone, but about building communities that could thrive in any environment. The alien students had discovered that humans represented something many advanced civilizations had lost during their technological development. They embodied the practical wisdom and cooperative spirit that had originally lifted their species to the stars. The panic they had felt was not because humans were superior, but because they reminded others of capabilities that could be recovered and shared. Professor Zixtal submitted his report with recommendations for fundamental changes to Academy survival training. Future courses would emphasize cooperative problem-solving, cultural knowledge sharing, and the practical skills that enabled communities to thrive rather than merely endure. The humans had taught everyone that true survival was not about individual competition, but about building homes and helping others wherever they found themselves, even in the trees of an alien world.